Hello everyone, here I am going to talk about the gross features of cerebellum. In this figure, this is the anterior view of this hindbrain. You can see this is the pons medulla. Here is the cerebellum, is a part of this hindbrain. So this is the anterior or this ventral view. There is a notch there anteriorly of the cerebellum which lodges this brainstem. Above this pons here there is the midbrain. This is the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. Then here this is the posterior view of the cerebellum, the posterior or this dorsal view. Okay, here this is the cerebellum. The middle portion that is called the vermis. This is the lateral here. This is the cerebellar hemispheres or this lateral hemisphere. The posterior here, this is the posterior notch, okay, which lodges the false cerebellae. False cerebellae here, it's a dural fold. Okay, here in this posteriorly here, this is the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Here you can see there is a medial longitudinal fissure which divides into right and left cerebral hemispheres. Between this occipital lobe and the cerebellum, here we'll get the tendorium cerebellae, a tent-shaped dural fold which separates this occipital lobe from the cerebellum. Okay, here we'll get a dural fold that is called the tendorium cerebellae. Here, coming to this location of the cerebellum, here this is the cranial cavity. This is the anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa. This is the posterior cranial fossa. Here this is the foramen magnum. Okay, we'll get the foramen magnum. This is the dural fold. This is called the tendorium cerebellae. This tendorium cerebellae of the right half is removed. Okay. So here above this tendorium cerebellae, this is the superior surface of this tendorium cerebellae. Here we'll get the occipital lobe. Below this here lodges the cerebellum. This is the cerebellar hemispheres be there in this each sides. Then coming to the features of the cerebellum, the average weight of the cerebellum that is 150 grams. Here in this first figure, that is the dorsal view. Here this is the ventral view. Here the dorsal or the superior view. Okay, here this is the anterior. There is the anterior notch. Here this is the posterior notch. Here this is the anterior. This is the posterior notch. The anterior notch here which lodges this one brainstem. The posterior notch here, there will get the false cerebellae. Then the middle portion here, this is called the vermis. Then here each sides, this is the cerebellar hemispheres. The cerebellar hemispheres, the middle part, that is called the vermis. Okay. Then coming to this lobes and the fissures. Okay. Importantly, there are three fissures. Okay. Here you can see this is the primary fissure. Here we'll get the horizontal fissure which separates this superior and inferior surface. So this is the inferior surface. This is the superior surface. Okay. So this is the horizontal fissure here which separates the superior from this inferior surface. Then this I told, this is the vermis. These extensions, this forms the cerebellar hemispheres or the lateral hemisphere. Coming to this ventral aspect towards anteriorly here, this is the nodule of this vermis. Here this is the flocculus of the cerebellar hemispheres. This collectively forms the flocculonodular lobe. Okay. Then above the primary fissure, this part forms the anterior lobe. Below the primary fissure, the green shaded area togetherly forms the posterior lobe. Okay. So here you can see there is a primary fissure, horizontal fissure. Then behind this flocculonodular lobe here, there is the posterolateral fissure. Okay. Then there is an anterior lobe. This is the posterior lobe. Then this one is the flocculonodular lobe. Okay. These are the lobes and the fissures. Then here this figure, this is the posterior view or this dorsal view. Okay, this towards posteriorly, towards anteriorly. this notch here, this anterior notch which lodges this brainstem. Here you can see this is the part of this midbrain. Then this is the vermis, this is the cerebellar hemisphere, this is the posterior notch. This surface, this is the superior surface. Okay. Here in the superior surface you can see here, this is the vermis, this is the primary fissure. So this is the anterior lobe. Here there is the horizontal fissure. Okay. Here which separates the superior and below there is the inferior surface. This forms the part of the posterior lobe. Then here in this inferior surface, here this is the vermis. See the vermis here, it lies deeply. Here this fissure is called the vallecula. The vermis lies deep to this vallecula here. This is the vermis, the fissure here that is called the vallecula. Then here this is towards anteriorly, posteriorly. Here this is the posterior lobe. Okay, here we'll get the flocculus and the nodule that will show in this figure. Here this is the inferior surface. Okay, this is towards anteriorly. You can see the brainstem lodges. This is the flocculus. Deep to there we'll get the nodule of this vermis. Together forms the flocculonodular lobe. Here this fissure here, this is the posterolateral fissure. This fissure, this is the posterolateral fissure. Okay. Then coming to the subdivisions of this vermis and the cerebellar hemispheres. Okay. This is superior surface. Here this view is the inferior surface. This is the vermis. This is the vermis here. This is the lateral hemispheres. Okay. Then coming to this divisions of this vermis from above downwards, there is first part here, there will get the lingula. Lingula we can better appreciate in this inferior surface here. This is the lingula. Then gets the central lobule. Here this is the central lobule. Then here this is the culmen. There is the primary fissure. Here we will get the declive here. This is the folium. Okay. Then there will get the horizontal fissure. Here below this folium, here in the inferior surface there is the tuber. This is the pyramid. This is the uvula. This one is the nodule. These are the parts of the vermis. Then coming to the extensions from the vermis towards the cerebellar hemispheres, those parts are lingula here is not having any extension. The central lobule here, the extension towards the cerebellar hemisphere, that part is called the ala. Then here this culmen, this extension forms this primary or this anterior quadrangular lobule. Okay. Then declive, the extension that forms the posterior quadrangular lobule here each side. Then there is the folium, extension of that forms the superior semilunar lobule. Here this is the superior semilunar lobule. Then the tuber here, extension that forms here, this is the inferior semilunar lobule, this area. Then here this is the pyramid here, this extension forms the biventral lobule, this togetherly. Then this is the uvula here, extension here forms the, here this is the tonsil, this area is the tonsil. Then nodule with this flocculus. Okay, these are the subdivisions of this vermis and the cerebellar hemispheres. Here in this figure, this is the inferior surface, this is the tonsil. Okay, here we'll get the uvula, okay, of the vermis. Okay, here this area is the tonsil. Here we can see this part is the tonsil, this one is the uvula, vermis. Then in the sagittal view of the cerebellum, here you can see this is the brainstem, this anteriorly there is the midbrain, pons and the medulla. Here posteriorly this is the right half, this is the cerebellum hemisphere. This is the vermis here. So here this division here in the sagittal view, it shows like leaf-like pattern, this leaf-like pattern that is called the arbor vitae cerebellae. Okay. Then coming to the parts of this vermis from above downwards, okay, there are here, this is the lingula, here this is the central lobule, here this is the culmen, this is the declive, this is the folium, then there is a horizontal fissure, this is the tuber, this is the pyramid, this is the uvula, this one is the nodule of this vermis. Okay. So these are the divisions of this vermis. Here this is the cerebellar hemisphere. This is the inner white core of this cerebellum. This is a white matter. Here it forms the superior, this is the medullary velum. Here we'll get the inferior medullary velum. This cavity is the fourth ventricle. Then again coming to the sagittal view of this brain, here this is the medial surface of this cerebrum, corpus callosum, lateral ventricle inside this cavity. This is the interventricular foramen. Here we'll get the third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct. This is the fourth ventricle. This is the midbrain, pons and medulla. This is the vermis. Okay, you can see this part is the lingula. Okay. Here comes the lingula, then comes the central lobule. Here this is the culmen, declive, folium, tuber, here pyramid, uvula, this is the nodule. Okay, so this first part here, this is the lingula, last part here, this is the nodule. Yes. Coming to this morphological divisions, okay, here you can see here these are the divisions of this vermis. These are the divisions of this lateral hemisphere of the cerebellar hemispheres. Then in this figure you can see here this area here, this is the anterior lobe, this is the floccular nodular lobe, this is the posterior lobe. Okay. In that floccular nodular lobe with this lingula belongs to the arcade cerebellum, that is the oldest one, arcade cerebellum. Then this anterior lobe with this pyramid and uvula of the posterior lobe belongs to this paleocerebellum, that is also old one. Then the remaining areas of the posterior lobe, okay, except this pyramid and this uvula, belongs to the neocerebellum. Okay, so these forms this morphological divisions of this cerebellum. Okay, so there is the arcade cerebellum, there is the paleocerebellum, and this neocerebellum. Okay, so function of this arcade cerebellum, which is concerned with the maintenance of this body equilibrium. Okay, then paleocerebellum is concerned mainly with the maintenance of this muscle tone and finer control of movements. Okay, the neocerebellum is for fine coordination of this voluntary movements, this neocerebellum. Okay. Then here we already explained. Then coming to this nuclei of this cerebellum. So when we take a section, horizontal section, through this horizontal fissure, okay, so you can see there is the inner of the cerebellum. This is the outer here, this is the grey matter which forms the cerebral cortex, okay, which forms here the cerebral cortex. Then inner here, this is the white matter. Inside the white matter you can see this masses of this grey matter. This forms the nuclei of the cerebellum. Okay, these are paired nuclei. You can see this crumble shaped, this largest ones, this forms the dentate nucleus. Okay, the dentate nucleus belongs to the neocerebellum. Then medial to this dentate nucleus, you can see there is the globose and this emboliform nucleus. Okay, there you can see this is the globose and this emboliform nucleus belongs to this paleocerebellum. Then median, there is the fastigial nucleus. This is fastigial nucleus. This fastigial nucleus belongs to this archicerebellum. Okay. So these about this nuclei of the cerebellum. There is the dentate nucleus. Then there is the globose and the emboliform. Then there is the fastigial nucleus. Then coming to this white matter of this cerebellum, okay, there are afferent fibers, okay, those fibers or the tracts entering to the cerebellum. Then there are efferent fibers there which are living from the cerebellum. So the fibers entering here, these are the fibers entering and living from the cerebellum is passing through the cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so this afferent and this efferent fibers forms their thick bundles of the cerebellar peduncles, okay, which is of white matter. So the cerebellar peduncles connects this brain stem to the cerebellum. Okay. Here you can see these parts of this brain stem are here. This is the midbrain, pons and medulla. So this midbrain here is connected to the cerebellum by means of the superior cerebellar peduncle. This is a sagittal view. Okay. This pons here is connected to the cerebellum by means of this middle cerebellar peduncle. This medulla here it's connected to the cerebellum by means of this inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay. So that's about the cerebellar peduncles. Then coming to this, here you can see the connections of this cerebellum. Here there is the east side, there is the cerebellar hemispheres. So this is the cerebellar cortex here we'll get. Okay. So there are afferent fibers coming from the cerebellar cortex, okay, which decussites and goes to the opposite cerebellum. The fibers coming from the spinal cord, which is going to the same side cerebellum. Okay. So these forms mainly the afferents. Okay. Fibers living from the cerebellum. Here you can see these are fibers are going to the cerebellum, to the thalamus, red nucleus and all, to this vestibular nuclei also. These forms the efferents. Okay. Here you can see there is the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts there. So this anterior spinocerebellar tract here, these are the spinocerebellar tracts. In that anterior and posterior there, these are coming from this gray horn of the spinal cord. This anterior spinocerebellar tract here, which carries this proprioceptive and the exteroceptive impulses of this upper limb, and also it through this superior cerebellar peduncle, it reaches the cerebellum. Okay. Then posterior spinocerebellar tract, which carries this proprioceptive impulses from this lower limb and the trunk, then it reaches the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay. Then there is a cuneo-cerebellar tract is there. This is the cuneo-cerebellar tract. Okay, here this cuneo-cerebellar tract here, it's coming from this accessory cuneate nuclei. You can see here this accessory cuneate nuclei in this medulla, okay, which carries this proprioceptive impulses from the head and neck, okay, to the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So medulla connects the cerebellum by means of this inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay. Then there is a vestibular nuclei there, okay, which carries this vestibular impulses from the labyrinth, okay, through this inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum. Okay. Then fibers coming from here from the cerebral cortex. This is the corticopontocerebellar. Here you can see from the cerebral cortex, reaches to the pontine nuclei to this internal capsule here, or this corona radiata reaches the pons. Okay, then it decussates. Okay, then it reaches to this opposite cerebellum. Okay, this forms the corticoponta cerebellar. Okay, which carry impulses from mainly from this motor areas and other areas of the cerebral cortex. Okay, then it reaches the cerebellum through this middle cerebellar peduncle. Pons connects the cerebellum by means of this middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, then there is the cerebro-olivocerebellar fibers are there from the cerebral cortex to this inferior olivary nucleus. You can see in this medulla, okay, which carries this proprioceptive impulses from the whole body, okay, through this inferior olivary nucleus, the decussation of the fibers, and reaches the cerebellum through this inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay. Then there is reticulocerebellar fibers. So reticular formation you can see in this pons and medulla. It reaches the cerebellum through the middle and the inferior cerebellar peduncle respectively. Okay. Then here you can see there is the tectum, that is a part of this midbrain. So tectocerebellar fibers are there which carry this impulses of this auditory and mainly the auditory and visual impulses, okay, through this inferior and superior colliculae then to the cerebellum. Okay, that is the tectocerebellar fibers, this one. Then coming to this efferent fibers, main efferent fibers, there is the cerebello-rubral, cerebellothalamic, cerebellovestibular. Here you can see cerebello-reticular. These are the main efferent fibers. So that's about this important connections of this cerebellum. So the function of the cerebellum here, which is the maintenance of this upright posture and balance. Then also here it's a coordination of, it helps in the coordination of plant motor functions, okay, with the help of this opposite cerebellum, okay, through this pondocerebellar tract. Okay. Then also here there is the control of the control of individual movement and coordination of the movements there. Okay, that is also the function of the cerebellum. Then here you can see the functions of this cerebellum. Okay, regulates body and limb movements, involved in planning, okay, and the initiation of the movements. That's all about the features of the cerebellum. Here about the nucleus of the cerebellum, there is the inner white matter. There you can see this dentate nucleus. Then there is the globose emboliform and the fastigial nucleus. Okay, so that forms the nuclei. Then white matter of cerebellum, that about the superior, middle and inferior cerebellar peduncles, which connects the brainstem with the cerebellum. Through there is the afferent and this efferent fibers entering and leaving the cerebellum, which forms the tracts. Okay, should elaborate the connections of the cerebellum that comes under the white matter of the cerebellum. Okay, that's all. Thank you.